The first thing Ambassador Velari Soth noticed about her new human bodyguard was how still he stood. Not still in the way of a trained soldier. Not still in the practiced, performance of discipline way she had observed in the Keth Honor Guard, or the Dravani ceremonial sentinels who existed, she suspected, primarily to impress each other. This was different. This was the stillness of something waiting without expectation, a quality she couldn't immediately classify, and that absence of classification unsettled her more than she was willing to admit to her attaché, Counsel Orindel, who stood beside her making polite noises about the new arrangement. "His name is Sergeant Marcus Webb," Orindel said, scrolling through the assignment dossier with 3 of his 6 fingers while the other 3 were occupied holding his data slate at the precise angle required for optimal reading posture. Orindel was meticulous about posture, decorated, multiple commendations, 12 years of service. The Terran Diplomatic Security Bureau rates him among their top 15%. Top 15, Velari said. Top 15. She studied the human across the arrival hall of Conclave Station. He was not large by human standards, she understood. Her briefing materials had been thorough on this point, because the Conclave had insisted on thorough preparation for the first Velathi ambassador to attend a full Galactic Council session in 70 years. Medium height, medium build. Somewhere in what humans classified as their middle decades of life, which meant, she knew, that he had already survived a statistical improbability of physical hardship simply by existing that long in a species that sent its young into active conflict zones. His hair was going silver at the temples. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow that her optical implants told her was at least a decade old. He wore the dark uniform of Terran diplomatic security without any particular pride or discomfort. He simply wore it. He had not yet looked at her. He was looking at the room. She realized with a slow and slightly uncomfortable clarity that he had been looking at the room the entire time she'd been looking at him. The Galactic Conclave convened, when it convened at all, in a chamber designed to make every species in it feel simultaneously welcome and irrelevant. This was not accidental. The founders, whoever they had been, their identity having been lost to the 600 years of administrative sediment that tended to accumulate around institutions that outlived their creators, had apparently believed that a mild collective existential unease was useful for diplomacy. You were less likely to start arguments, the architectural philosophy went, when the room itself reminded you that the cosmos was indifferent to your outcome. Velari had been in the chamber twice before as a junior attaché. She had felt the unease both times. She felt it now, walking the long processional aisle toward the Velathi delegation's assigned tier, surrounded by the murmur of 47 species conducting the elaborate ritual pantomime of pre-session socializing. Behind her, 2 steps back and 1 step to her right, the standard Terran protective position, she had been informed, Marcus Webb walked. He did not speak. She had not expected him to. Bodyguards were not conversationalists, but she found herself acutely aware of him in a way she hadn't anticipated, a low-frequency attention that she couldn't entirely account for. She'd had bodyguards before. Velathi security specialists, a Keth warrior cast retainer for 3 months during the border tensions, a Dravani rapid response unit during the succession negotiations. She had been aware of all of them the way one was aware of furniture, present, functional, occupying space. Webb occupied space differently. She couldn't say how. Ambassador Orindel materialized at her elbow with the practiced appearance of a man who had never not been there. The hegemony delegation has requested an informal conference prior to the session opening. Delegate Shan Kavath specifically. Shan Kavath specifically, she repeated. The hegemony. Of course. The Velathi return to the council after 70 years was not, she understood perfectly well, an occasion of uncomplicated welcome. The hegemony had spent portions of those 70 years occupying Velathi colonial territories under the legal fiction of protective administration. The fact that the Velathi were back at the council table implied a renegotiation of several arrangements the hegemony had come to regard as permanent. Shan Kavath requesting an informal conference before the session opened was the diplomatic equivalent of a warning shot fired from very close range. "Tell him I'm available," she said. Behind her she heard, or perhaps felt the distinction was difficult, a very small adjustment in Webb's movement pattern. Not a step, not a sound, something almost beneath perception, a recalibration. She filed it away and did not examine it. Delegate Shan Kavath of the hegemony was, by all relevant measures, an impressive creature. He stood 2.5 meters tall, which was average for the Kavathi subspecies, and his carapace had been polished to the kind of deep blue-black sheen that signaled either great wealth or great ambition, usually both. He had 4 primary manipulators and 6 secondary ones, all currently arranged in the configuration that hegemony protocol specialists classified as formal benevolence: open, slightly elevated, angled to suggest both greeting and the theoretical possibility of embrace. His 2 senior advisors flanked him. Behind him stood 4 members of the hegemony's apex guard, which was what the hegemony called its diplomatic security detail, and which was considered one of the most elite protective forces in the known conclave. They were each nearly 3 meters tall. Their integrated combat plating was visible beneath their ceremonial coverings, the way muscle is visible beneath skin. They had been selected, Velari knew, at least partly for their visual effect. Webb stopped when she stopped and stood at his 2 steps back 1 step right position, and Shan Kavath's 4 primary manipulators arranged themselves in a new configuration that her implants translated as noting the human. "Ambassador Velari Soth," Shan Kavath said, in conclave standard. His voice carried the harmonic undertones that the Kavathi used to convey sincerity, or its convincing imitation. "It is a genuine pleasure. The hegemony has hoped for this reunion with the Velathi people for many years. Delegate Shan Kavath," she said. "The feeling is," she paused, a pause long enough to be deliberate and short enough to be deniable, mutual. One of his advisors made a sound that her implants could not categorize. Shan Kavath's manipulators shifted again. "You have brought a human for your protection," he said. The harmonic undertones had changed to something that the implants translated with unusual hesitation as either polite curiosity or mild contempt. Often the same thing in hegemony culture. "Sergeant Webb," she said. "Yes." "A single human," Shan Kavath said. She did not respond to this. There was nothing to respond to, not technically, not in any way that wouldn't grant it more weight than it deserved. She waited. "The hegemony uses 4 apex guard per senior diplomat," he said. It was not a boast, it was a comparison. The distinction mattered in hegemony protocol. Boasting was crude, comparison was instruction. "I'm aware of hegemony security standards," she said. "Of course." The harmonic undertones settled into something unmistakably satisfied. "We were simply noting that the Council may find it unusual. A single human, without augmentation, we understand." "Without augmentation," she confirmed. She heard from 2 steps behind her the very small sound of Webb shifting his weight, just slightly. A micro-adjustment of stance that she had already begun to understand without quite meaning to was not restlessness. It was attention recalibrating again. She had heard it in the arrival hall. She had heard it twice during the walk to this meeting. It happened, she was beginning to notice, precisely when something in a conversation changed. Shan Kavath had not noticed it. His advisors hadn't either. The apex guard certainly hadn't. They were watching her, and watching the corridor, and watching Shan Kavath, and they were watching everything that they had been trained to watch. Webb was the only one in the room who appeared to be watching the apex guard watch everything. The conversation with Shan Kavath lasted 11 minutes and accomplished what it was designed to accomplish, which was the establishment of hegemony leverage before formal proceedings began. They wanted the colonial territories back, or more precisely, they wanted the legal status of the colonial territories to remain exactly as it was, which meant they wanted the word back, to remain permanently unavailable to Velathi diplomatic vocabulary. Shan Kavath communicated this with considerable elegance, through a series of statements about historical partnership and mutual investment in regional stability, that any first-year diplomatic student would recognize as territorial claim dressed in altruism's clothing. Velari communicated her understanding of this with equal elegance, through a series of responses that acknowledged nothing, conceded nothing, and closed no doors. They were extremely polite to each other. It was, she thought walking away, one of the more hostile conversations she had conducted in recent years. Webb fell back into position without being directed to. "Your assessment," she said quietly when they were far enough from the hegemony delegation that her directional audio dampeners would contain the words. There was a pause, short enough to be processing, long enough to be genuine. "The one on his left," Webb said. His voice was low, unhurried, completely without drama. "Second advisor." He kept looking at the guards' positions, not yours. Twice he shifted toward the exit corridor before correcting. She processed this. "You think there was a secondary purpose to the meeting?" "I think someone in that group wanted to know where you were going next," he said. "That's all I think." She didn't respond immediately. She was recalculating Shan Kavath's advisors in her memory, re-examining the meeting through the lens Webb had just handed her, and finding that it fit. Not conclusively, nothing was conclusive, but it fit the way a properly calibrated instrument fit a calibrated space, without slack. "You noticed all of that," she said, while appearing to be watching nothing. "That's the job," he said. She walked 3 more steps before she spoke again. "Top 15%, she said. "Ma'am, I'm revising that estimate." From 2 steps behind her and 1 step to the right, Marcus Webb said nothing. But she had been paying attention now, and she heard the small sound of his weight shifting, not recalibration this time. Something different. Something she didn't have a classification for yet. The council session opened the following morning according to 600 years of accumulated procedural tradition, which meant it opened 40 minutes late, and with a structural debate about the order in which the structural debates would be conducted. Velari sat at the Velathi delegation table and listened to 9 species argue about parliamentary procedure, with the focused attention of someone who understood that parliamentary procedure was often where the real negotiations happened. Webb stood behind her chair. He would stand for the next 6 hours, she knew. She had offered him the secondary seat. There were 2 chairs at each delegation table, and he had declined with a politeness that hadn't quite been refusal and hadn't quite been acceptance of the arrangement, and had mostly been a very quiet way of saying that sitting was not compatible with the job. She had not pushed it. The Kavathi delegation sat 3 tiers below and to the left. Shan Kavath's 4 apex guard rotated positions on a 90-minute cycle. She had timed them during the first procedural debate, and maintained a perimeter that encompassed both the delegation table and the 2 nearest exit corridors. They were by all observable measures an exemplary protective formation. Watching them, Velari understood exactly why the hegemony had mentioned them. They were the visible grammar of hegemony power, organized, substantial, impossible to ignore. She had mentioned this to Webb during the morning briefing. "They rotate on a schedule," he had said. "Yes, every 90 minutes, I believe." "Every 93, he had said without particular emphasis, the way someone mentions the correct time when someone else has stated it slightly wrong. She had looked at him. "You've been timing them since last night." "We arrived last night." "Yes," he had said. She had thought about asking how long he had slept. She had decided not to ask. She suspected the answer would give her a feeling she wasn't prepared to examine before a 6-hour council session. The incident happened in the 3rd hour, during a recess, in a corridor off the secondary gallery. Velari had requested 5 minutes to review correspondence in the small anteroom the conclave administration provided to senior delegations. She did not, in the ordinary course of events, need to explain this request or justify it. It was routine. Orendel had gone to collect the correspondence from the delegation support staff. The anteroom was between 2 larger corridors, accessed by a single narrow passage that was not, officially, a security concern. 2 of Shan Kavath's advisors were waiting in the narrow passage. Not the second advisor, the one Webb had identified. The first advisor and a third one she hadn't memorized yet, both in hegemony formal diplomatic attire, both with the particular stillness of people waiting in a place they have chosen with some care. One of them held a document tube of the kind used for sealed correspondence. It was, technically, a completely plausible reason to be in a corridor, delivering a document. Everything about it was technically plausible, and all of it was wrong. She felt rather than heard Webb move. He was in front of her before she had finished processing what she was seeing. Not beside her, in front of her, which shifted her entire line of sight to the back of his shoulders, and which meant she was watching the advisors watching him rather than watching the advisors watch her. She saw the precise moment they recalculated. It was visible. A small, involuntary adjustment in their bearing that her implants classified as reassessing threat vector, which was a phrase that did not belong in a diplomatic corridor during a council session recess. Ambassador Velari Soth's schedule does not include unscheduled correspondence, Webb said, quietly, without aggression, the way someone states a fact about weather. The first advisor produced what might have been a smile, in the limited sense that Kavathi facial musculature permitted. This is an urgent communiqué from Delegate Shan Kavath requiring. Any communiqué from Delegate Shan Kavath requiring priority delivery can be submitted to Counsel Orendel, who manages the ambassador's correspondence. He's in the main corridor. A pause. You passed him to get here. The second advisor, the one she hadn't memorized, made a small sound. The first advisor's smile modified itself into something that no longer bothered trying to be a smile. We were not aware, he began. I'll let Counsel Orendel know you have something for him, Webb said. He'll be right with you. He did not move. He did not gesture. He did not, by any physical action she could observe, do anything other than stand in the narrow corridor between her and two creatures who were each significantly larger than him, with the particular quality of stillness she had noticed the first moment she'd seen him, but altered now, sharpened, the way a familiar sound is altered when you hear it in a different room and understand for the first time what it actually is. The advisors left. She stood in the anteroom for a moment after they had gone, listening to the sound of her own circulatory system being louder than it should have been. What, she said carefully, was that? I don't know yet, Webb said. He was still watching the corridor, but Orendel should probably not be alone right now. She contacted Orendel immediately. He was fine. He had in fact been standing in the main corridor with the delegation support staff for the past 8 minutes. The advisors had walked past him. He confirmed this with some confusion. The advisors had looked at him, he said, then they had kept walking, as if they had already known who he was and had been specifically not going to see him. She looked at Webb for a long moment. They weren't delivering a communiqué. No, they came to deliver a message, she said, not on paper. That's my read, he said. She thought about Shan Kavath's polished carapace and his precisely arranged manipulators and his harmonically sincere voice discussing historical partnership. She thought about 70 years of protected administration. She thought about the Velathi colonies and who was currently living in them and under whose flag. A message that I should not feel safe, she said. Yes. And you thought that one human bodyguard was sufficient protection against. I thought, Webb said, still watching the corridor, that if there were 2 of them delivering a message and 2 of them had walked past Orendel to get here, there were probably 2 more somewhere else. And I thought whatever they were planning wasn't going to happen right now, because right now would be traceable. Whatever they're planning is going to happen somewhere with less documentation. He paused. That gives us time. She realized her circulatory system had not quieted down. Time to do what? Time to make sure they see it coming, he said, before they try it. She did not ask him to explain that. Something told her the explanation would be clearer if she watched it happen. What Marcus Webb did over the next 18 hours was, in retrospect, the least comprehensible aspect of the entire event for the species who later attempted to analyze it. He did not hire additional security. He did not request conclave protection services. He did not alert the Terran diplomatic contingent elsewhere on the station, though he had the clearance to do so, and the resources would have been provided within 40 minutes. He did not, as far as any subsequent review could establish, sleep for more than 2 hours combined across the entire 18-hour period. He mapped the station. Not from the schematics. He had already reviewed the schematics, he told Velari later, on the transport from Earth. He mapped it by walking it, in the hours between council sessions, while Velari was secured in the delegation suite and Orindel was managing the administrative work of diplomacy. He walked every corridor he had clearance to access, and several he technically did not, and he catalogued what he found not by writing it down but by remembering it. This was, apparently, something humans practiced, the deliberate architectural memorization of space. Some ancient mechanism, Velari later learned from a human cultural briefing she requested after all of this was over, descended from an era when humans who moved through dangerous territory could not afford to be surprised by it twice. The body learned the space. The mind held it. It cost nothing except time and attention, and Webb appeared to have calibrated both of those resources at a ratio that other species that slept in longer cycles, or required more recovery between sustained focus periods, or simply assumed that a secured facility did not require this level of scrutiny, had not thought to question. On the morning of the second full council session, he found the approach they were planning to use. He did not find it through intelligence. He did not find it through informants. He found it because he had walked a corridor near the secondary docking ring at 2 in the morning, local station time, and noticed that a particular door showed where patterns inconsistent with its stated function as a maintenance access point. The where was on the exterior handle. Maintenance access points were designed to be operated from the inside. Someone had been using that door as an entrance. He told Velari this at the morning briefing. He told her what he thought it meant. He told her what he intended to do about it. He was specific about two things: what she should expect and what it would cost him if the cost calculation he had made was wrong. She listened to all of it. At the end, she said, "You could simply inform council security." "I could," he said. "They would investigate. Shankavath would be notified. The hegemony would claim it was unauthorized action by a rogue element. No formal charges would be possible. The colonial territories question would stall for another decade while the diplomatic fallout was managed." He said nothing. She continued, "Whereas if we do what you're describing, the council sees it live," he said. "No rogue element claim holds, no deniability. And you," she said, "are in a maintenance corridor with no backup, alone, against however many of them there are." Webb looked at her. His eyes were the particular dark gray of deep water in conditions that made depth difficult to estimate. "Yes," he said, "you've calculated the probability." "It's not really a probability calculation," he said. "Either it works or it doesn't. The math doesn't change whether I like the numbers." She wanted to tell him that this was not a rational approach to personal safety. She wanted to explain that the colonial territories, however important, were not worth a human life, specifically not his human life, which she had become attached to in ways she was still categorizing. She wanted to point out that there were other options, slower options, less costly options. She said, "What do you need from me?" What she needed to do was be visible. The third council session opened at the usual time, with the usual delays, and Velari Soth was seated at the Velathi delegation table with Council Orindel beside her, and the secondary chair behind her conspicuously empty, and her bearing precisely calibrated to project the mild, attentive serenity appropriate to a senior diplomat. She spoke twice during the first hour, once on the matter of colonial administrative review, which was a calculated escalation from the previous session's language, and once on the proposed timeline for the conclave's economic integration framework. Both times she watched Shankavath. Both times she watched his advisors. The second advisor, the one Webb had identified at the first meeting, was absent from the session. She noted this without reacting to it. She continued to speak about economic integration timelines. The words came out of her mouth exactly as they were supposed to, shaped by 30 years of diplomatic training, while the rest of her attention was in a maintenance corridor on Deck 7 of the secondary ring, where she could not see and could not help, and could not do anything except continue to speak about economic integration timelines, and trust that the human she had sent there would come back from it. This was the thing she had not anticipated about having a bodyguard like Webb, that the protection would turn out to be mutual in a direction she hadn't foreseen, that she would find herself, at the moment when it mattered, protecting him by doing her job. That the currency of his safety was her visibility, her continued, composed, documented presence in this room, speaking these words, providing the cover his position required. She had spent 30 years understanding protection as a thing done to her by others on her behalf. She was doing it now, differently, and the shape of it was terrifying. She was 47 minutes into the session when the Council security alert activated. The alert was not what any of them expected. It was not a breach of the Council chamber. It was not a communication intercept. It was a security response to what the station's automated systems had logged as an altercation in Maintenance Corridor 7 Gamma, secondary docking ring. An altercation that the systems had classified as involving 4 life sign readings and a significant disruption of ambient atmospheric conditions in the surrounding 15 meters, which was the station's polite way of saying there had been violence. The Council chamber went still in the way of large bodies of water in the moment before something large surfaces. 47 species, hundreds of delegates, the accumulated diplomatic weight of the known galaxy's political structure, all of it suspended in the specific silence that occurs when something has happened that doesn't fit the script anyone was using. Shan Kavath's manipulators had moved into a configuration her implants could not immediately translate. His 3 present advisors, the second still absent, had all shifted in their seats simultaneously. The 4 Apex Guard were still in position, technically, but 2 of them had changed the angle of their head posture by approximately 15 degrees, which was the Kavathi equivalent of a flinch. Velari sat at the Velathi table and did not allow her face to do anything it was not supposed to do, and waited. Webb walked into the Council chamber 11 minutes later. He walked in through the main delegate entrance, because that was the entrance he had clearance for, and he walked at a measured pace, because that was the pace appropriate to a diplomatic security officer entering a chamber in session. He had his uniform jacket on. The jacket was torn on the left shoulder, and there was a bruise rising on the side of his face that his skin's color made dramatically visible, and he was holding his left arm with a carefulness that was not vanity. He had, she understood immediately, something broken in it, something that would have made most forms of conflict impossible to continue, and had not made him impossible to continue. In his right hand he held a document tube, the kind used for sealed correspondence, the exact kind that had been carried in the narrow corridor outside the anteroom by 2 hegemony advisors the previous day. He walked to the Velathi table and placed it in front of her and said quietly, as though reporting a routine security update, "There were 4 of them, Ambassador. The tube contains evidence sufficient for formal charges. The Conclave Security Office has 3 of the 4 in custody. The 4th is the second advisor from yesterday's meeting. He's in the medical wing with a separated shoulder." She looked at him. She looked at his arm. She looked at the document tube. She said, "You need medical attention." After this, he said, and the weight of those 2 words, their absolute uncomplicated certainty, the complete absence of drama in them, went through the Council chamber the way sound goes through water. She saw it. She watched it move. Species who communicated through atmospheric vibration, through light frequency shifts, through chemical signals, all of them received it, each through their own sensory apparatus, each in their own register. After this. Not after I've rested. Not when someone else can take over. Not once conditions are more favorable. After this. She opened the document tube. The evidence was exactly what he had told her it would be, a complete record of the planned intervention, stamped with authorization codes that traced directly to the hegemony's diplomatic intelligence division, not to any rogue element, not to any individual acting without sanction. Shan Kavath's own seal was present once, in a location that admitted no innocent interpretation. The Council was still silent. She had never in 30 years of diplomatic service heard it this silent. She stood up. She was aware of herself standing, aware of the chamber, aware of the weight of 70 years of Velathi absence from this table and what it meant for this moment to happen now. She was aware of Webb standing behind her, broken arm held carefully, bruised face expressionless, because whatever was required of him right now was still required, and he was still here, and he was going to be here until it was done. The Velathi delegation formally requests the Council's attention to a matter of documented diplomatic misconduct. The formal proceedings lasted 3 days. Shan Kavath's authorization seal proved to be what it proved to be, irrefutable. The hegemony's legal team produced 17 objections to the chain of evidence, and the Council's procedural body dismissed 15 of them inside of 40 minutes, which was approximately 17 times faster than the Council's procedural body had ever dismissed anything in the institution's entire history. The colonial territories question, which had been expected to require at minimum 2 sessions of preliminary discussion before anyone was willing to permit it onto the formal agenda, moved to primary consideration on the second day. By the third day's close, 3 of the 7 Velathi colonial territories had received formal status restoration. The remaining 4 were referred to a joint review commission with a binding 6-month timeline, which was, in the careful arithmetic of institutions that had been managing the same disputes for decades, a revolution conducted entirely through parliamentary procedure. Velari signed the documentation in the same chamber where she had watched 47 species process the sight of a single human walking into a room with a broken arm and a document tube and 2 words. Webb was present at the signing. He had had his arm set, a hairline fracture of the radius, the medical report said, in addition to the bruised ribs, the torn shoulder fascia, and the orbital contusion that had spread from the bruise on his face into something dramatic enough that 3 species delegates had asked Orindel, with varying degrees of tact, whether the human would survive. Orindel had provided polite reassurance each time, with the slightly dazed quality of someone who had asked the same question himself and received an answer that didn't quite fit the emotional category he'd been prepared for. Webb's arm was in a biocast that immobilized it from wrist to elbow. He was standing at his position, 2 steps back, 1 step to the right when she signed the last page. "You could have sat down," she said, "for the signing." "I was fine," he said. She looked at his arm. She looked at his face, which still showed the yellow-purple of healing damage across one side. She thought about the 4 individuals who had been in Maintenance Corridor 7 Gamma, and the separated shoulder that the second advisor was recovering from, and the phrase she had read in an old human military document, once that she had not, at the time, understood as anything other than poetic hyperbole. "Will continue to function until the mission is complete." She had thought that was a statement of capability. She understood now that it was a statement of choice. The question circulated through the diplomatic community for weeks afterward. Not officially. Officially, the incident was processed, documented, assigned its bureaucratic coordinates, and filed. Unofficially, in the quiet channels through which conclave diplomacy actually moved, in the side conversations and the attached communiques and the briefings that were requested by delegation after delegation from the Terran Diplomatic Bureau, the question surfaced in 100 different phrasings that were all the same question. Why? Not how. The how was documented. The corridor map, the doorway pattern, the 3 hours of memorized station architecture, the calculation that 4 opponents in a confined space with predictable positions was a manageable variable. The mechanics were available to anyone who wanted to read them. The why was harder. The Kavathi Diplomatic Analysis Bureau produced a 40-page report concluding that the human had acted from rational self-interest, that his professional standing, his species' political position, and his personal career advancement had all been served by the outcome. It was a thorough report. Several member species found it persuasive. Shan Kavath himself, conducting the deposition that his eventual plea agreement required, stated that the human had calculated the risk and accepted the acceptable odds. A Velathi cultural liaison named Taurus On, who had been assigned to prepare Velari's delegation briefings, and had therefore spent considerable time attempting to understand humans in the abstract, requested a private conversation with Webb before the delegation departed. This conversation was not documented, but Taurus on later described it to Velari in terms that she spent a long time turning over in her mind. Taurus on had asked Webb, apparently, why he had not requested backup, why he had not used the 40 minutes of available time to bring additional human security assets to the station, why he had chosen to go into that corridor alone when alone was, by any standard probability assessment, the inferior option. And Webb had looked at Taurus on with those deep water gray eyes and said something that Taurus on had initially classified as deflection, and had then reclassified as explanation, and had finally concluded was neither of those things but was instead something for which his species did not have a precise classification. It needed to be done, and I was the one there. Taurus on had asked if that was all. That's all there is. Velari Soth returned to the Velathi homeworld to a welcome that she absorbed with the practiced composure of a senior diplomat, and then retreated from as quickly as she could without giving offense. She spent 3 days writing her formal report. She spent a 4th day writing the section that described the role of Terran diplomatic security in the Council's proceedings, which was the section that the Foreign Ministry had flagged as requiring the most detail. She described the corridor incident accurately and completely. She described the evidence retrieval accurately and completely. She described the council session. She described the silence. She was on the 5th day, revising the language she had used to describe Webb's entrance into the chamber when she stopped. She sat for a long time looking at the sentence she had written, which was, "The bodyguard entered the chamber and presented the evidence, despite having sustained injuries in the altercation that would have incapacitated most trained security personnel." She deleted the last clause, not because it was inaccurate, because it assumed that incapacitation was a binary state, a threshold you either fell below or did not, and what she had watched Marcus Webb do was not a question of threshold. It was a question of something the sentence didn't have room for. She left the sentence as, "The bodyguard entered the chamber and presented the evidence." She thought about writing more. She thought about trying to explain to the Foreign Ministry's analytical staff, who would read this report with the careful attention of people whose job was to extract policy from events, exactly what she had understood in the 3 days of proceedings that followed that entrance. That the Council's unusual speed, its procedural efficiency, its unwillingness to permit the hegemony's 17 objections their normal glacial consideration, none of this was attributable to the evidence alone. Evidence existed. Evidence was evaluated. Evidence was weighed and argued and qualified and contextualized. Evidence, in an institution 600 years old, moved at the pace of 600 years of accumulated caution. But 47 species had watched a human being walk into a chamber with a broken arm and say after this and mean it, completely, without performance, without calculation, without any residue of self-preservation clouding the simple clarity of the statement. And something had shifted in all of them, in all their different sensory and cognitive registers. Something that the Diplomatic Analysis Bureau's 40-page report about rational self-interest had missed entirely, because it was not a rational phenomenon, and it had not emerged from self-interest. It had emerged from something that humans apparently carried with them, the way other species carried their genetic material, and their cultural memory, and their instinct for survival. Something that did not have a name in the Conclave's languages, because the Conclave's languages had been built by species that had never needed to name it, never encountered it in any form that required naming, had moved through 600 years of accumulated diplomacy in the reasonable assumption that at some identifiable point, a rational actor would stop. The Kavathi report called it risk tolerance. The Dravani cultural analysis called it threat miscalculation. The species who communicated through light frequencies called it, in translation, the persistent signal. Velari sat in her office on the Velathi homeworld and looked at the sentence she had written and thought about the morning briefing in which a man with dark water eyes had told her that the math didn't change whether you liked the numbers. She did not write anything else in the report. She submitted it as it was. But she thought, in the months that followed, about the silence in the council chamber, Not the silence after the alert, not the silence of political calculation or procedural uncertainty, but the silence that had happened in the space between Webb walking through the door and the first delegate finding a voice to speak. She had been in that chamber for 30 years cumulatively, across a career of diplomatic service. She had heard debates that shook the conclave's legal foundations. She had heard confessions and accusations and the kind of formal eloquence that moved policy across decades. She had heard every register of institutional voice that 600 years and 47 species could produce. She had never heard it go quiet like that. Not awed quiet, not frightened quiet. Something more precise than both. The quiet of creatures encountering, in a form none of them had prepared for, the specific shape of a species that had not learned to stop at the edge of what was reasonable, had never agreed to be bounded by what was probable, and which sent its people out into the galaxy with a broken arm and a document tube and 2 words that meant, without apology and without drama, and without any particular consciousness of what they revealed, that there was still something left to do and they were still here, and those 2 facts had always been enough.